Wang Wei City Song. Morning rain wets the light dust in Wei City. Willows, spring green, so green, beside the guest house. Let's drain another wine cup. West of the Yang Pass, no old friend awaits you. So with this and the following poem by Wang Wei, we introduce the last of the sections of the 300 Tang poems. This is a rather small section composed of 6, 7, 8, 9 poems, and they are defined as 7-word quatrain Juefu. And again, this is a bit confusing. If you just look at them in some translations that I've seen, these poems are just bundled into the same sack as the heptasyllabic quatrains, and in fact, I think they're generally almost undistinguishable from the heptasyllabic quatrains. Juefu is, I think we've mentioned it before, is a rather ambiguous critical category of Chinese poetry. That is, Juefu, a type of Shi. After all, this collection of poems that we're studying only includes Shi poetry. So Juefu, in its origins, I think we've talked about this, Juefu poems were born during the Western Han Dynasty as ballads, as popular poems that got their name Juefu because that was an institution, the Bureau of Music, that collected these ditties and popular ballads as a sort of demoscopic survey as a way of gauging the opinion of the people. But also had poetry experts, composers who composed ditties, songs, probably based or inspired in this oral poetry for ceremonies of state and things like that. It is believed that this poetry it was not completely regular in meters, although it probably alternated pentasyllabic and heptasyllabic, and probably those alternations in the lines probably reflect the melodies that accompanied these poems in the Western Han times, which have been since lost. Now, the classical Shi, whether pentasyllabic or heptasyllabic, but especially the pentasyllabic, was also born at this time in the Tang Dynasty, but we have the Han Dynasty, but we have very few evidences of this poetry until the very end of the dynasty and the beginning of the next period, the Three Kingdoms, which is when literati really start taking the pentasyllabic Shi and converting it into a prestigious literary form. But as I said, there's a certain indistinctness, at least for me, between Juefu and old pentasyllabic poetry, except when the Juefu, like in this case as well, it has 7 syllables, well, it's not pentasyllabic, obviously. But when it has the same number of syllables as an old poem, whether pentasyllabic or heptasyllabic, or the same number of lines as in a quatrain, I think the adscription to the Juefu is probably connected with the titles and sometimes, but not always, with the subject matter. So as we said, Juefu in its origins were ballads, and then the scholar officials moved away from them, but others went back again to the ballad subject matter, like recreating literary ballads instead of the rough and ready original unknown poems. Also, a critic that I've read lately establishes the difference of Juefu with Shi in the sense that in the Juefu, the speaker is very impersonal. It's a stereotypical figure, whereas in the Shi poetry, the speaker is more, the individuality of the author as speaker of the poem is more pronounced, and sometimes also in the Shi, the author impersonates poets, but not generic figures for the most part, but ancient poets from the past. So, giving a cursory glance at all the poems in this section, most of them are about topics that would appear in ballads, life at the frontier and this sort of thing, which is a very popular theme in balladry. So this collection, we said 9 poems. The best represented poet in it is Li Bai with 3 poems, and then there's a Thai, Wan Changling and Wang Wei with 2. Okay, let's move on to this quatrain. So this quatrain is called Wei City Song. Now, Wei City, Wei Cheng, I think it was a place that was located not too far from Chang'an itself. I think I read in the notes to this poem that it was in the northwest direction and 15 miles northwest of Chang'an in the northern bank of the Wei River. So in the capital area is this Wei city, and this is, as you've probably noticed while we were reading it, because it's a pretty straightforward poem. This is a parting poem, and Wang Wei has tons of them. In fact, while I was searching in another book for another version of this poem, it took me a long time to find it because there were so many poems of parting. So this is a parting poem. Wang Wei's poetic persona is saying goodbye to another person. And the person, not from this translation, but from other translations I know, is called Yuan II or Yuan II, who is going off to the western regions, to Anxi. That is also present in the original version's title. So Anxi, pacified west, referred to the area of what is current-day Xinjiang, Turkestan in Central Asia. And this was an area that during the greatest periods of Chinese imperial power, so during the Han Dynasty, during the Tang Dynasty, they were incorporated as satellite vassal states under superior Chinese administration, generally with a protector of the western regions in the area. But it was basically an autonomous area with small kingdoms and cities that was basically self-governing with a few Chinese colonies. And it was an important link in the trade route of the Silk Road, which passed through most of these small city-states, which were located mostly in the Tarim Basin, in a small fertile area locked amongst deserts and mountains that surround it. So this poem is therefore a parting poem. This Juan Tu is leaving the capital area and he's going to Anxi on a mission, and Wang Wei hosts a party for him in Wei City. Not unusual for parting banquets to take place outside the capital. There would have been perhaps someone's inside the capital itself, but then at the last posting or at the last guest house, almost on the way to the western regions, another party would have taken place. So the scene, as we've said, is this parting, this last parting celebration. Probably Wang Wei has spent the night, perhaps with other friends and with this Juan Tu, at a guest house in Wei City. So this guest house might have been just an inn, open to anybody. I'm not sure. I would need to check in other places, but some inns were state controlled or state run, and they were the people who were on state service got special or free accommodation, I imagine. But this is just a guest house, and there were frequent scenarios for these partying parties. So they are probably spending the night together, and this poem is set in that night celebration. Much quaffing and wine drinking has taken place, and Wang Wei just asks his friend to take yet another cup of wine because he's going far away into the western regions, and he will find no intimate friends of his there, far away from the capital region. So, topic of parting, separation, and it's a quatrain, so it's very short, but it includes references to spring, which is the background, the seasonal setting in which the poem takes place, and therefore it imbibes some of the conventional images of many poems of spring that also include separation, although that's usually separation of lovers. Okay, so I think not much to say. We will comment more things when we read the other translations. Let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. So first couplet. Morning rain wets the light dust in Wei City. Willows spring green, so green, beside the guest house. So, the first poem, as usual the first couplet, sorry, as usual in a quatrain, sets the scene, the time and the place, the chronotope. So, we know it's the morning, as the first character says, it's morning rain, it's raining in the morning, and the light, that rain is wetting the light dust of Wei City. So now we know where we are. We're in Wei City, relatively close to the capital. And again, we get spring in the second line. Willows spring green, so green. So it's the problem. The high tide of the spring season, and the willows are a shiny green. And we are beside a guest house. So we still do not necessarily know that we are in a parting poem necessarily, but we do know that we are in Wei Cheng, close to the capital, and we know that it's spring, and we know that it's the morning. So it's not imbibing at night. I was wrong at that, now that I think about it. Probably the poet and his friend have spent the whole night awake, drinking and singing, and this is like the last morning drink before the final separation. Okay, so second couplet. And the second couplet moves us from the description of the scene to the more subjective element, that is, the direct speech of Wang Wei addressing his parting friend. Let's drain another wine cup. West of the Yang Pass, no old friend awaits you. So the Yang Pass is just a mountain pass that would have been to the west of quite to the west, in fact, of Wei City, and the corridor of Gansu that leads to the northwestern region. Probably, I'm not sure, I would have to check a map, but perhaps close to Dunhuan, which is also an important last outpost of Chinese civilization before going into the western region. So beyond that pass, and the image of beyond the pass is used a lot in Chinese poetry. Beyond that pass, no friends will await you. All will be foreigners, all will be foreign faces. So that's a poem. So a pretty straightforward parting poem. Like, this is early spring, it's green, it's shiny, it's fresh, it has just rained. We are separating in this morning. Let's drink one last cup for old time's sake. Wherever you are going, far to the west, you will not find friends. Now, this translation in this edition was by David Lunde. I have here another translation, in this case by Paul Rosa, from the complete poetry and prose of Wang Wei, which was published, I don't know, 1 or 2 years ago. Or perhaps it was in 2022. Not completely sure. I bought it recently. No, 2021. Yeah. And, no, 2020. Just check the copyright. So here the poem is called Seeing Off Juan Tu on his mission to Anxi. It's a more literal translation of the title. And it goes like this. Morning rain at Wei City dampens the light dust. The hostel is all green. The willow hue is new. I urge you to drain yet another cup of ale. Once you head west out of Yang Pass, there will be no old friends. So not too many differences. The gist of it is pretty much the same. There's just been some juggling around with words. For example, ale instead of wine. We're talking about probably chiu, which is a liquor made from fermented cereals, although I think it was refined quite a lot afterwards. So more technically, it would be a type of beer indeed, a type of ale, because it's not grape wine, obviously. But perhaps it had more of a consistency like wine, probably quite fluid and liquid. I think there were different types of alcohol anyway. Okie dokie. And the last version I have is from the Poetry of Wang Wei by Pauline Yu. And she also comments a little bit before the poem. She says, well, she translates this poem with another group of short parting poems. And she says, farewell poems provide a predictably apt context for developing notions of time and space, and Wang Wei's many works written on such occasions are no exception. Poems 88 to 97 of her collection were all composed on the departures of various friends and colleagues, mostly for government posts in the provinces. In almost every case, Wang Wei characteristically traces the path or events his addressee will soon traverse and experience, thus, in effect, collapsing time and space into an all-encompassing whole. Poem 89, Farewell to Juan II on his mission to Anxi, is a notable exception, for its last line drifts off into the unknown. This sense of incompletion must have been apparent to traditional audiences. However, for when the poem became a popular farewell song, the last line was repeated 3 times. So this gives an extra meaning to the last line of the poem, that going west from Yang Pass there are no old friends. This poem became very popular. In fact, it became so popular that it became a staple fare at parting meetings during the Tang, and instead of composing a new poem or reciting another one, this one was recited a lot of times. So it was a bestseller, one of Wang's probably most popular poems. But it had this added element that Pauline Ju has just commented for us. The last line was repeated 3 times to emphasize that sense of not knowing exactly where you're going and what you're going to do. And yeah. And I've just read from a note in her book that yes, the Yang Pass is in Dunhuan district. So yeah, it's pretty close. It's in the territory of Dunhuan. So her poem is Farewell to Yuan II on his mission to Anxi. And it goes like this. In Wei's city morning rain dampens the light dust. By the traveller's lodge, green upon green, the willow's colour is new. I urge you to drink up yet another glass of wine. Going west from Yang Pass, there are no old friends. So in her version, wine again appears probably as a more evocative term in the Western tradition than ale. But it's interesting, she's more literal, just like Rosa's version that we've just read. And but the second line is probably the one that has the biggest divergence with Lunde's version, the first one we read, where in the 2 translations that we've just read, it's emphasized that the green is the greenness of the lodge, which is painted green, apart from the green of the willows. And in fact, the willows are described as new. That newness would imply the greenness. It would imply the new leaves that the tree emits when spring has come around. So altogether quite an interesting poem in all its different variations.